in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water.
Hello, church family. Today we'll be discussing spirituals. I'll discuss the origins of slavery in the United States, how spiritual singing started, and to what end they were used. Then we'll explore a few spirituals and what makes them unique. The first historical record of note of slavery in the United States, or at least the English settlements, was made in 1619 by John Rolfe when he mentioned the arrival of a slave ship to the Virginia colony with 20 and odd Africans. While this account and the year 1619 was popularized in textbooks as the supposed year that slavery began in America, we now know that it was much earlier than that. It's more likely that the first Africans brought to the Americas were included during Columbus's expedition to Hispaniola, Haiti, in the late 1490s. The first documented example of Africans being taken against their will dates to 1441, when a Portuguese captain captured 12 Africans in what is now modern-day Mauritania, bringing them back to Portugal as enslaved people. Slaves in the Americas were used initially in the Caribbean when the sugarcane industry exploded, and it was discovered that the distillation of molasses could make rum, a cheap and potent liquor. On the continent, slaves were used in southern plantations to pick tobacco, and later cotton, as well as various other farm and household labor. Suffice it to say, slavery was a disgusting practice. Discussing the atrocities committed during this time in our history is out of the scope of this video, but it cannot be understated how this practice, along with the genocide of the American Indians, was truly our country's original sin, the repercussions of which are still being felt today. Fearing non-compliance and outright revolt, most owners insisted that their slaves be converted to Christianity. It was thought that if they shared the same God, they were less likely to violently resist. During the 1700s, in locales such as New Orleans, slaves were given Sundays off to worship and allowed to congregate in one public venue known as Congo Square. It was at this spot that the fusion of African rhythms and syncopation, Latin percussion, and European forms would all coalesce, eventually forming jazz. But way before jazz, the slaves transplanted their tribal songs through oral tradition, updating the lyrics to include stories from the Bible, stories about enslavement, overcoming adversity, and hope for a better life than this one. These songs would later be known as spirituals, or spirit songs, coming from Ephesians 5:19 in the King James Bible, which says, "Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord." If spirituals were sung to uplift the soul, worship God, and give hope for a better life, could they also serve other purposes? The answer is yes. Slaves were required to work from sunup to sundown, and singing was used to pass the time, repeating physically exhausting motions to the beat of the music. Overseers encouraged singing because they ignorantly thought it meant the slaves were happy, and they could audibly keep track of where they were. But passing the time and lifting their spirits was not the only reason spirituals were sung by the slaves. An entire subsection of spirituals are known as code songs, and they were used to relay important information back and forth, signaling the time, place, and method for escape. Of the nearly 4 million slaves in the U.S. by the time of the Civil War, 100,000 were actually successful escaping, and hundreds of thousands more attempted escape daily. The idea that most slaves were content to stay where they were is simply untrue. Let's look at how these spiritual code songs were implemented. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot references the story of Elijah being taken up to heaven in 2 Kings. In reality, the song was a call for abolitionists, a band of angels, to swing low, meaning to help the slaves in the South, either with political support or physical shelter while escaping. Steal Away to Jesus is another spiritual that explicitly states the desire to steal away, a phrase which means to stealthily leave. On a spiritual level, "I ain't got long to stay here" means that our suffering on earth is relatively short compared to an eternity in heaven with God. It also means to keep a keen eye and ear for more signals that the time to escape is nigh. Other code songs gave advice for how to evade slave catchers. Follow the Drinking Gourd instructed runaways to look for the Big Dipper to orient them on a northerly route, while Wade in the Water admonished them to cross the river to throw the bloodhounds off their scent. There's an obvious biblical parallel with the plight of the African slaves in America and the Israelites in Egypt. Like Moses leading his people to the Jordan River, where they crossed into the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman led 300 slaves to freedom using a network of safe houses known as the Underground Railroad. Tubman, who was nicknamed Moses, was what was known as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She would embed herself in a plantation as a slave, then lead runaways to stations or depots. Stations were typically between 10 to 20 miles apart from one another, located in barns, church basements, and hollowed-out riverbanks or caves. The slaves would rest during the day and travel at night. Tubman was the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, but countless other abolitionists offered their homes as sanctuaries as the runaway slaves attempted to cross the Jordan River, which in this case was the Ohio River, the boundary between the free states and the slave states. But how did code songs and other spirituals come to be known by the general public? Last week, I discussed the novelty of folk song collection and cataloging during the advent of recording technology. However, prior to recording technology during the Civil War, 3 staunch abolitionists and scholars would travel to Port Royal on St. Helena Island in South Carolina and document the songs sung by recently freed slaves. Harvard scholars William Francis Allen and Charles Pickard Ware and Philadelphia musician Lucy McKim Garrison were able to listen to and transcribe 136 songs from this trip, publishing the earliest known collection of African American spirituals in 1867. This collection, entitled Slave Songs of the United States, is the best effort of college-educated scholars to transcribe music that was never intended to be written using the European method of musical notation. Most of the songs use a major pentatonic scale, that is a 5-note scale, typical of African music. The editors decided to write the lyrics in local color, meaning the words are spelled phonetically according to how they heard them pronounced. We can never be sure how these songs really sounded, and there were certainly regional variations. But it is this collection that was used as the basis for spiritual singing by groups like the Fisk Jubilee singers, who spread the exposure of this music to America and Europe. The Fisk Jubilee singers gave their first tour in 1871, traveling along the same path used in the Underground Railroad. They were the first group to record Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in 1909, and the choir is still active today. Unlike the slaves, these trained singers sang spirituals in the classical style, encouraging more than 100 years of performing and arranging spirituals by people of all ethnic backgrounds and religious denominations. When we sing spirituals, let us not forget the struggles and the sorrows of the oppressed people who first sang them. We can enjoy the uplifting messages of these songs while also acknowledging our troubled past as a nation. That's all for this week. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at spirituals. In the description below are several links to performances of some of the spirituals I discussed today. I'm also still taking questions about hymns and church music for the lightning round version of Hymn Time, which will air next week. Send your questions to music@firstpress-elcajon.org. Also, don't forget to share Hymn Time with family and friends. See you next time.